I think it's very important in the beginning, and I don't normally do this, but I want to tell you a little bit about me, how I did my learning. Because we all pretend that we don't think back to what we did, but we do in ways. And I grew up very privileged from a wealthy family, and went to what you call public schools. And when I was in my senior year, or junior and senior year of high school, just before college, I did very well in math, and I did very well in art. So I said to the headmaster, since I do well in math and I do well in art, I'm obviously going to go and study architecture. Now, this man was actually quite brilliant, because he said something to me, and I was 16 or 17 years old at the time, that went completely over my head. He said, he might have called me Nicky. He said, Nicky, I like pinstriped suits, and I like gray suits, but I hate gray pinstripe suits. And that comment, I thought it was kind of poetic and sort of kind of got the point, but went to architecture anyway. And did architecture school for 2 professional degrees and thought at some point probably that I was going to be an architect. But in the process of doing those years of architecture school, I discovered computers. And using computers for what was then a very nascent field, computer-aided design, graphics, and all of that, I suddenly realized that the human interface, computer graphics, man-machine interaction, all of that was the pinstripe suit that I liked. So I stayed in the Department of Architecture, but I always used design, which I had learned, as the key element of everything I did going forward. And then one more thing that I want to tell you by way of introduction, and then we'll get to some of the roots and, I think, really critical things that are happening right now. And that is that I met a man named Seymour Papert, whom, if you don't know, you should certainly read his work. I would assume that most people in this room have read his books. But this was now 1968. And in 1968, Seymour found, discovered, invented a very important point that computer programming was a form of learning. And that if you wrote computer programs, it was the closest you could get to thinking about thinking. Because when you enumerate an algorithm and you execute it, it never works the first time. When you go in and you debug it and change lines, and it finally works, what I have described to you is how we learn. It's an iterative process. There's trial, there's error. There are all those elements. And I genuinely thought in 1970 that 40 years later, the entire world of education in primary school would be built on computer programming, and kids would be playing with computer programs in first grade, and it would be, all the things that we knew then as school were going to sort of disappear in favor for this new instrument that allowed people to think about thinking. And it didn't happen. And constructionism as a concept that you learn through doing and you learn through making, and which to me, from my design background, was so important, fell off the table. It fell off the table for 2 reasons. One is that there were people, and there was no benevolence in this, there were people who were making systems of software, often tools, but not that often. Usually they were applications that would be used by users. The word user came very prominent, that the user would use material that some experts made so that it was more like publishing a book, more like making a curriculum, more instructionist. And that change that has occurred, at least it's a change for me because I anticipated the opposite, is a very profound and to me disturbing one, because I see things like Khan Academy that are instructionism and even badly done instructionism. I see things like your Minister of Education who says things that are so outrageous, I almost didn't want to come to London. Okay. But you see the instructionism taking a foothold, and then the computation that I and others and some of you in this room, we all were inventing became the tool of instructionism, not the tool of constructionism and computer programming. So that's just a point of view, and it's you don't have to share it, but it's kind of where I come from. So I would go back to this slide. This slide is sort of the end of the story. It's a preview of the end, and in some sense, everything I'm going to do now is a flashback. These are kids in Ethiopia who are learning how to read on their own. And we're running an experiment to see, and it's an experiment, it's not a big, massive project. Can children learn how to read on their own? Because if you can learn to read, you can read to learn. So that's very precise, small experiment. So here's the first thing. I've started in my own mind to separate them, to sort of how do I clear out, how do you talk to that minister? How do you talk to somebody and say, I say, first thing you do, Mr. Minister, please think carefully that education and learning are different. And if you want an analogy, education is to banking what learning is to economics. You can't have a strong economy with a weak banking system, but economics is a big thing that has many elements to it. And education and learning are very, very different. And you can go one step further and you can say banks are to banking what schools are to education. There's still on that side, there's still this other thing called learning. And if you can tease them apart and understand them and celebrate more and more what maybe doesn't happen in the context of school, or to go back to programming, I'll give you a very specific example. We ran the first sort of mini computer, they were called at the time, in a very poor district in New York where we were introducing to the kids the computer programming language Logo. Lego Logo is what it's currently called, hence the slip. But Logo was the language. And the kids who had learned Logo were better spellers in their other classes. I said, wait a minute. What does spelling have to do with writing Logo programs? And the answer is real simple. What's the best part of writing a program? For those of you who've done it, hey, you all talk to each other. I won't do that. No. The best part of writing a program is debugging. It's the fun part. It's really fun. It's great satisfaction. You find the bug. You're annoyed at the bugs, but you find them, and then there's this sense of satisfaction, and it's wonderful. The kids who had learned to write Logo programs had learned to love the errors, love the bugs. So what happened in their spelling class? This was not by any prearrangement, not same people, not even same floor, anything. When I had a spelling bee at school, I was a bad speller, still am. I would get 8 words out of 10, if I got 8 words out of 10, which was a B. A B is good. So what do I do with the 2 I got wrong? Right under the carpet. I didn't want to see those words ever again. I got 8 right. And school had taught me the more right, the better. And I just swept them under the rug. The logo programs, the kids were talking to each other about which word they got wrong. Oh, didn't you know it was I after E except after C? Oh, no, and this, and suddenly the celebration of the errors is what made them shoot to the top of that class. Now, sounds a little abstract, but it's still, in my mind, the difference between learning and looking at learning and dealing with the tons of self-made, in many cases, issues that come with education, like banking, and schools like banks, that is the systemic more than the developmental and cognitive issues that come with programming, that come with looking at it as learning. So I'm going to take you back to only '82. I started the work that I'm mentioning in the '60s with Seymour, and in 1982, we went to 3 countries, Pakistan, Senegal, and Colombia. Before the IBM PC existed, this little girl is in Senegal, doesn't speak English, doesn't speak French. We were connected to the internet, or at least it wasn't called the internet. We had connectivity, but they didn't. And the device is an Apple II. Steve Jobs gave us a few thousand that we put in these villages. We were very much there. I have tons of pictures of Seymour and I looking at, working with, showing the kids. And it seemed like, even though they speak no French, no English, only Wolof, that they were playing those keyboards just like pianos. Both, or all 3 rather, of those projects way ahead of their time. The Media Lab opened its doors for business, and I spent the next 20 years, or 19 as the slide shows, the next 19 years building the Media Lab. So I didn't spend too much time doing it. Seymour continued, had a whole group at the Media Lab that looked at, this pretty fancy name, it was called Epistemology and Learning, was the name of his group. And he had people working on the next steps of learning by doing and using the computer program, but it was always very, very small. Then by chance, in 2001, and I could take up tons of time telling you the whole story, but suffice it to say, by chance, I found myself in northern Cambodia in a village that didn't have a school. So I built a school. It had no electricity, no telecommunications, so there's a satellite dish in the back, and there's a generator you can't see, and my son was living in Italy, having girlfriend troubles and not starting a company or not succeeding to start a company. And I said, look, if you can suffer the indignity of working for your father, why don't you go to Cambodia and connect this school, and I'll send you up laptops. And he did such a good job. That was the birth of the one laptop per child program. These kids, most of whom are still in school, even though it's 2001, they were in the 1st grade here, so they are still in either 1 or 2 are in high school, the rest are in college. When I looked at this picture, and I said, God, this is extraordinary. I'm talking about not just the picture on the screen, but the village. My son built a house in the village, and so we live in the village. And nobody had electricity except us, but what people did have were laptops. And so even when they weren't using them, they were left open, because that was the light source of the house. It's connected to the internet. These kids they knew every single football player on the Brazilian team. They had complete and open access to the internet, and they had a certain amount of stuff on the laptops, and they were all learning English as a second language as well. And I looked at this and I said, what in this picture is not going to happen through normal market forces? Because in this case, a tooth fairy came along, me. And I spent the money to send the laptops and build the school, then build the little house next door. And everything I could see in the picture or even imagine, because you can't quite see it, was going to change with just the course of history and market forces. Electricity would come to the village, whether it's, part of the grid as we know it, whether it's using new natural ways of making electricity. Telecommunications would eventually get there. Yes, we need satellite in between. But the laptop bothered me. And the laptop bothered me because built into the laptop in 2001 was a steady state cost. And by that I mean each time Intel made a faster processor, Microsoft used more of it. So Intel made a faster processor, Microsoft used more. It went on and on. We joked about it in conferences, and people would say, yeah, it's true. And by doing that, which in some sense deprives us of the speed because the speed is being given to features, you get featureitis, it also is the case the price stayed pretty stable. So what we did, we looked at it and we said, let's not strip stuff out of laptops. Let's design one for kids that has to do with communications, sharing. This is in the early days of Facebook. Its interface looked like Facebook. The person who was the technical person was this technical person at Facebook. So we decided we'd do one laptop per child, which is not what I'm here to talk to you about. This is just sort of background. But one laptop per child, for me to ignore it would be wrong. Partly because there are 3 million of them out there in 40 countries. And what have we learned? I mean, there's a lot of stuff you can have learned with that number of laptops in the hands of kids. And in 6 years, believe it or not, we have spent about $1 billion. People have probably no real sense of scale. And that $1 billion includes the activities in the country that don't report to us. But so as a total package, that's what it's been. Now, it's been spun off. It has its own directors and its own executives. I'm not even on the board. And if they get in trouble, I certainly help. But it started off very well. And in fact, Khan of Khan Academy has done the same thing, and I applaud him highly. And that is, started off as a nonprofit. And I find that very important. Not everybody has to be a nonprofit, but for me it was really important. It made the difference between discussing and thinking of children as a mission or a market. And when I started this, it was a mission. And when the CEO of Microsoft or the CEO of Intel has to talk to a potential country or minister, it's a market. He has a fiduciary responsibility to a totally different group of people, not to the minister. So I thought it was very important for me to be able to look in the eyes of the minister and say, Mr. Minister, we don't take any margin from our laptops. The cost and the price is the same. We're paid for by ourselves and through other means, gifts from generous supporters. And I could also look in his eyes or her eyes and say, whether you buy 1,000, 100,000, or 1 million, it makes no difference to me. It really doesn't. I don't even draw a salary. So let me tell you what I think you should do. And it's so much more plausible. And also by being a nonprofit, you have partners like Kofi Annan, and we launched it together in November of 2005. And what we launched then was this machine, a little silly in retrospect, but everybody remembered the pencil yellow crank. And at one point, this was in Tunis, and because of Kofi Annan, not because of me, it was about a room this big, but flat, not raked, just with TV cameras all along the back. And somebody yells out, "Kofi Annan and Nicholas Negroponte, crank your laptops." And so folded closed and put mine by the desk and started cranking, and Kofi Annan was on the other side of the stage, closed his and started cranking. And as he's cranking, these are engineering prototypes, the handle falls off in his hand. This guy is so cool. He doesn't look down. He doesn't change the motion of his hand. He sits there, perching the thing, moving the stick in air as he thought it was going to be, with the little other one standing thing, and nobody noticed. I thought that, I don't know if I could have done that. I would have gone, "It broke," or something like that, or "Did I break it?" Or, it's not him. And it was a very, very, very nice way to launch it. This is what we finally launched, and it had so many features. Maybe that was its problem. It had too many technical features. We figured peer-to-peer, what is now called mesh network, learning was very important, so you didn't go to a Wi-Fi system to send you to a server, maybe a mainframe, to come back to talk to your neighbor, that you really used peer-to-peer, and those little ears were a mesh network that allowed you to talk to your neighbors, and it was the way you communicated. Now, if this were a classroom and you all had one of those laptops, it wouldn't work very well, because there's so many people in this room, every laptop would hear every other laptop. And so it works much better in the density of African villages, and it's a problem that still has to be solved. But it was an important detail, because the kids did really collaborate. And the other thing we found is that when kids got in, this is Peru, when kids got involved, they were so deeply involved. And this part you know it very well, but it just engrosses you. And here, we don't have to argue about constructionism versus instructionism. It's just the passion, the involvement that is, from my point of view, the biggest responsibility of education, the institution, is to keep the passion, which it usually doesn't keep. It usually gets rid of it. We had imagined a lot of kids using them solo, kids on the street. We had not imagined kids teaching their parents or their grandparents. We can't fix the number too exactly, but it's over 100,000 kids in Peru are teaching their parents how to read and write. And if that doesn't put goosebumps on your goosebumps, I don't have too many stories. It was something that really turned out, for us, very, very important. Colombia, Nepal, Peru again. Now, as we were doing this, we're now back 5 years ago. I was single at the time, so I could travel all over the place. And I traveled about 320 out of 365 days a year, often spending 3 nights a week on British Air. Because we had these 6 countries, Thailand, Pakistan, Libya, Nigeria, Argentina, and Brazil, where in each case the head of state said publicly that he would do 1 million laptops. Now, that was very important to me because we had money because we had sponsors, but you're talking about such large pools of money to trigger supply chains and to get manufacturers. You're talking about not just the tens of millions of dollars, but the hundreds of millions to get this thing going. So it was almost, it's a little bit like a smokescreen, because if you had Shinawatra saying, I'll do all my people, and Musharraf saying, oh, I'll do, and Gaddafi in his better days saying, I'll do all my people, and Obasanjo, and Lula, and Kirchner. The people in Taiwan who were designing and the people in China who were manufacturing, this was all very plausible. But then about 5 years ago, the day of reckoning came. You know, I got a lot of buzz, but I have nobody writing checks. And so that's kind of the emperor has no clothes here, and what do we do? So what we did then is, in a relatively short period of time, we went to the 3 countries who had been coming to us. So here we had been trying to date the 6 most attractive people in the bar, and we went to the people who were actually coming after us. And that was Uruguay, Peru, and Rwanda. And the reason I show this picture, this was when Uruguay, a small country, 400,000 kids, the president said, I'll do every child. Every single child from 5 years to 12 years, I guess it was, 5 to 12. And I will do it before my presidency ends. And he had 3 years to go, a little less than 3 years. By virtue of saying that, no teacher or nobody at school said, oh my God, I'm not going to get one. You might get it in 3 years instead of, it's like rolling out electricity. It all can't happen simultaneously, but everybody's going to get one. Very important. The teacher in this classroom, who had been teaching for 30 years, decided, laptops, I've had a wonderful time teaching, I'm out of here. And so she went to the Social Security office and asked for early retirement, which wasn't quite so early, but she was eligible for it. And they say, come back in 3 weeks. And during the 3 weeks, those laptops arrived. And the energy, not just because they're yelling in this picture, but the energy in the classroom was spectacular. And she had assigned them a project to do something for social science that included cows. And a young girl went home, because they all own the laptops, they all take them home, and told her father that she was stuck. She didn't quite know what she would do for her cow project. And her father said, sweetheart, you're very lucky, because tonight our cow is giving birth. So the little girl was allowed to stay up. There's a camera on the laptop and video the cow giving birth, and brought that to classroom as her project. She wasn't a particularly good student, but boy, did she have a good project. And she went in the next day, and the other kids and the teacher just couldn't believe this project. And then they got together as a group. Remember, I think they might be 9. I think they're 8. It doesn't really matter, but they're that age group. They figure out how to upload it to YouTube. And they upload it to YouTube, and it gets 100,000 hits. The teacher couldn't race fast enough back to the Social Security office to say, wait, I want late retirement. And she's still teaching there today. So the people who love it are the teachers. They're teaching in ways, I think I have one more slide of that kind, that they never had before. This man always taught in a straight line. The kids sat on towels that were perfectly sort of perpendicular with his little line in the front of the room. He had a little whip, a little like fly swatter, that he'd use when he asked questions. He says, what is the answer? And you'd hear a little snapping sound. And so all the kids, nobody wanted to ask a question. This is how they teach now. He never, and this isn't a professional photographer, by the way, that's going in and this is how they teach and how he teaches. And the effect on the kids, on the teacher, on the family is extraordinary. It is such the opposite. I hate to go back to your Minister of Education, but send him this picture because that's how you learn. It's not rote, it's not memorization, it's not all of those things. And so that was a very important thing for me to realize because we get a lot of bad press about being anti-teacher, supposedly. And so we live with it, but it's really the teachers that are the ones that have benefited the most in the classroom settings. So the last piece of this episode is to turn the laptop into a tablet, which was done in 2012, has features, and it's a wonderful tablet. It's not clear to me it has to be built, but there it is, it can be. $5 million, push the button, and 30 days later, 1 million of these come off the assembly line per week. So if you want to make 100 million of them, it's possible. We haven't done it. We had to do the laptop because everybody said it was impossible. Nobody's doing it. Here, it's more of a threat. So if a country, it's a threat in two senses, but probably the most interesting is when a country puts out a bid to have tablets or laptops for their country, we can bid this tablet. And we announce our prices in advance, and that basically pulls everybody else down in the bid, so governments like us. So after working on the tablet, it was announced a little over a year ago. Maybe a few months before, I looked at myself and I said, what am I going to do next? The laptop, we said there would be 50 million of them in the world by now in the hands of kids. There are. They just don't happen to be my tablets, but that doesn't matter. There's still, that's mission accomplished of one sort. And so as I was looking for what to do next, I came back to this constant refrain. And when you have a name like Negroponte, you do not get false positives on Google. So Google alerts, it's my brother or me. And I like finding out what he's doing, so we can use it that way. And I would say about once a day, in a blog, not necessarily a mainline newspaper, but in a blog, I'd see something like, Negroponte believes you can give a kid a laptop and walk away. And I thought, wow, what if you could? What if you could do that? And maybe not a laptop, a tablet. Why would you want to do that? Because there are 100 million kids that do not go to first grade. And they live in places like that. It's another one. In fact, these are real places I'm going to talk to you about. This one, they spend most of their time looking for water. This one, they spend most of their time looking for animals, and they don't grow vegetables, but they pick whatever they can find. So there are 100 million kids who don't go to first grade, and when I look at projects, including ones done by the UN and one looked at by the Gates Foundation, and everybody's advocating that kids should go to school. There's something called Millennium Goal number 2, which is all kids will be in school by 2015, which is very close. most people don't realize, including the leadership of some of those programs, that the reasons that kids do not go to school, more often than not, is there is no school. There isn't. These two villages don't have schools. They're amongst many, many villages that don't have schools. Now, when I say they don't have schools, I mean they don't have primary schools. Primary schools, to me, are important because if you screw up the beginning, it's kind of hard to catch up and to make up and so on. Though in places where there aren't schools, or the nearest school is 10 miles away, when you're 5 years old, you can't walk 10 miles. So you wait till you're 12, and then you walk the 10 miles. So it is not uncommon for those of you who have been to the developing world to find a first-grade class with 10, 11, and 12-year-olds in that class because they're the ones that finally decided to walk the distance or could walk the distance. So not having schools is something, of course you want to fix it. You want to build, but we're talking about numbers, in the millions. They're talking about building a lot of schools, training a lot of teachers, doing all the things that should happen. But in between, is there something we can do in parallel different? Namely, can these kids do some of, and maybe all of, primary school learning on their own? Pretty big question. We broke it down even further to get a very specific one, and that was the question of, can a child learn how to read on his or her own? Because if you can learn to read, you can then read to learn. So reading is a very important piece. It's not, again, so much now the constructionist coming out of me, but it's a very simple algorithm. If you can get to that cusp, which tends to happen at about the age 8, if you can get to that cusp without any teachers, without any electricity, without any schools, without any et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the kids can start teaching themselves, is that an interim solution that could happen very quickly? By the way, the cost is about 50 cents per child per week to do it if it works. So we decide we do an experiment in those two villages. And what we did is we brought to the village tablets in equal number to the kids. So if there were 25 kids in the village, there are 25 tablets. I don't think there was too much sort of, this is only for the kids. It is, somebody might have said that at one point, but the kids are the only ones that even thought of using them or trying them. They were left in the village in closed boxes with no instructions and no people. Nobody. The only thing that happened is the day before, one person, an Ethiopian, went into the village and showed one adult how to set up the solar panel, which is a little smaller than this display, that is used to charge them. So you needed a charging station because there's no electricity. Now, I don't know what it's called in the UK. In the United States, it's called the IRB. It's the group that evaluates the use of humans in experiments and checks that you're doing everything right and you have the permissions and so on. We did all of that. Even though Ethiopia doesn't care less, we did it anyway. And that is because the tablets are hot. And what I mean is that when you open the box, the tablet isn't on, but when you turn it on, it records when, where, how long it's been on, what app you're using, how many minutes you're spending in each app, what you're doing in the app in some cases, and it stores all that data. So it was very important because then we knew we could once a week send somebody into the village and they could swap SIM cards, and we'd have all the data of what every single child did at every moment that they're using the tablets. So let me just tell you a couple of things. It took them less than 3 minutes to turn on the first tablet. They'd never seen an on-off switch. And if you've ever used a Motorola Zoom, you'll know that the on-off switch is really hard to find. It's in the back and it's so on. Within 5 days, they were using 50 apps per child per day. 50. 50. Within 2 weeks, they were singing ABC songs. And within 5 months, they had hacked Android. No teachers, just them, and just the discovery of what was on the tablets. And I'll show you, I think this next picture, that's perhaps my best picture. The boy on your right, not clear what he's doing. Not sure if he has an organizational role or if he's just an onlooker. Can't tell. But the other 5 each have their own laptop. The kids keep their laptop. You sort of bond with it, and it's not as if it goes off to a shelf and you get another kid's laptop. But you can see the kid on the left is using the other kid's tablet, and the other one's using the other, et cetera, et cetera. These kids had never seen a written word. There are no road signs, there are no labels on bottles, and there's no literate person in the village. The only exception we've found, and it was pointed out to me pretty recently, is that some of the shirts they're wearing have labels on the back of the shirt. So, I mean, yes, they have seen a few letters. And they are picking it up so that now the village, this has gotten a lot of press, and so people arrive and kids have press conferences. And this was apparently some press conference the kid was giving to show the person that she, or let me go back to that one, that she could write things on, letters and what are called the precursors to reading that are very, very important. Now, this isn't complete. There's more to happen. And if at the end of 1 year, more, they're reading, doing what's called deep reading, that's pretty transformational. And it's pretty important for those 100 million who don't go to school. So I'm hoping this is going to continue. I say hoping because I'm funding it myself and not sure how long I can do that. But it would also tell us something about our own schools. Because if those kids in Ethiopia learn how to do deep reading in 2 years, why are so many, and I've heard numbers as high as 30%, of the public school kids in New York not learning to read after 8 years or 6 years? What's going on? Clearly, the potential of the brain to speak is unquestionable. Take a child from any place on this planet and drop that child in Paris, and that child will speak French, assuming age 5, 6, 7, 8, that kind of age, will speak French in a few months. Over 1 million years, our brains have evolved for that to happen. It's a little bit like walking. Reading's different. Reading is 3,000 plus years old, and our brains don't do it naturally. They just don't. You cannot, wish you could, drop a kid in some country called Reading Land and 6 months later, they read. Now, there may be a few kids, maybe some of your own, whom when you're reading them books at night, they see words, they're experiencing pages at a very early age, they memorize them, and they'll probably do deep reading a little early. When somebody says they have a 3-year-old or 4-year-old that does deep reading, they just don't. And by the way, if you don't, it's not good for the child. It's very bad for the child. But at any rate, that's a separate subject. But I think we can, with this project, do 2 things. And then I'll leave for questions the time, a little bit less than what I promised. Those kids will become the teachers and teach themselves as schools are being built in those countries, and 10 years from now, these kids may be gone and going to college, but it'll be a place, once we do get teachers in schools, it'll be really well set up. You'll have almost little Montessori students helping you build the school. I mean, you're gonna arrive not in the middle of nowhere, you're gonna arrive in places where learning has in fact happened through technology.